born in Czechoslovakia in 1935. And the family I was born into, I was the second child of my mother, who had a first marriage. And I have an older half sister who's almost 12 years older, not quite 12 years older. Czechoslovakia was subsumed by the Germans, and parts of it was subsumed by the Germans in October of 1939, I guess it is, in the famous quip, Chamberlain waved his paper. I'm sure you've seen the news stories. He waved his paper, peace in our time, and he gave the Sudetenland away to the Nazis who incorporated the Sudetenland into, well, what was Germany and Austria, which they had already annexed to Germany. So our family was sort of refugees early. We moved into the central part of Czechoslovakia. And then when the Germans finally invaded the entire country, we seem to have gotten on a plane a day before the record says they marched in, and we flew to Switzerland. I was, by that time, I was I had not hit my fourth birthday yet, which would have been in June of 1939. And when I say we flew to Switzerland, it was my father, my mother, my older sister, and myself. We must have stayed in Switzerland for about 2 weeks, and I fished out my mother's old passport and my sister's passport, and discovered that we then ended up in France. 2 weeks later, where we stayed. And now you may wonder what happened to my sister's father. He did not leave, and eventually my sister's father was perished in the Holocaust. Anyway, we were in France, where my sister, my mother, and my father stayed for a while until literally June. Well, in June of 1940, the Germans occupied France. The family, and now I say my family, which included my sister, my mother, and me. And you may wonder what happened to my father. My father was a medical doctor who, as a medical doctor, was a reserve officer in the Czechoslovak army. By 1940, there were a whole bunch of Czechoslovak soldiers that had escaped from, Czechoslovakia, in German invasion. And that group of Czech soldiers and he found their way to North Africa, where they joined the British, and they wore British uniforms and so on, And my sister, my mother, and I ended up in southern France. My mother got ill, and they took me to a organization run by something called OZE, where they sheltered children, refugee Jewish children. The children all spoke German. A child walked up to me and started speaking German, and I started responding in German. I was among the youngest people. I was 4, I hadn't hit 5 yet, and eventually I left. But I remember that I was, in some ways, felt very secure. And it was the older women in that place, probably the teenagers, or maybe even the girls, maybe even up to 12 or whatever, that were put in charge of the very young children, the toddlers. It's interesting that when we got to France, at one point, I don't know where it happened, may have been when we were in Vichy, France. My mother didn't quite get what was going on. I mean, she was, according to her, if it wasn't for her, we wouldn't have escaped, because she was very, very frightened, had seen what was going on in Germany about anti-Semitism and so on. And essentially, according to her, she kind of convinced us to leave and so on. So, but in some ways, she was totally naive. She somehow thought that if we were Christians or converted or something, that they wouldn't bother us. In other words, she thought that the anti-Semitism really sort of depended on what religion you practiced, not who, not your birth, okay, or and so on. So when we got to southern France, she found some people, priests or ministers, I guess you'd call them, of a Protestant Czech sect who had some ministers or whatever, and they gave us baptismal papers saying that we're Christians. And she knew them from Czechoslovakia, it seems. I don't know how. She implied that she knew them. And when I was a lot older, I'm not that much older, but let me put it that way. When I was, by the time I could sort of figure out what was happening, maybe when I was 12 or whatever, I said to her, Mom, did you really think that somehow these baptismal papers were going to save us from something? And she said, well, what do I know? We ended up going through Andorra and Spain to Portugal. And
how did you travel, by train or?
Well, no, that was sort of by foot, and we had to sneak across the border. And
the Spanish border, French-Spanish border?
It was through Andorra.
Yeah, well, that's a good way to go.
Right. And I didn't learn it until, I didn't figure it out until I was about 70. My mother's brother, my uncle, happened to get to America in 1939. And he managed to get us visas to America if we could get to Lisbon. And I guess that convinced all the people on the way. In order to get through a country, you had to have a visa to get somewhere else, right? They didn't let you just sit here. So we got to Lisbon. My father was in North Africa. And eventually in Lisbon, that we got immigration visas in February 17th of 1941. Now, I had not turned 6 yet. I would have turned 6 in June of 1941. So we sat around in Lisbon, and it must be after February of 41, February 17th of 41, that we would have boarded a ship called the Nyassa and came to America. I can't find anything on the passports that actually say when we landed. A person said to her, that boy speaks Czech, German, French, Portuguese, but wait till you get to America. He doesn't speak Yiddish. Wait till you see how important it is for him to speak Yiddish.
What about English? Did you speak English at all, or was that?
Not a word. And my mother and sister did not speak a word of English. Yeah.
Do you happen to know when you got the visas, do you happen to know if you had to pay for them, or was that something your uncle set up ahead of time?
My uncle, well, here's the story. You wonder why we got here to begin with, because, this might interest Ted a bit. A lot of the children in the school that I was sent to in France who spoke German actually got here as children through the Friends service, the Quakers. Okay. Now, I met some of them, and some of them came on the same ship on the Nyassa, but they were the small children. Apparently, the older ones, the adolescents, could not be rescued. And a lot of them ended up in France. Some of them were captured. Some of them were in the underground and so on. But so there must be a whole bunch of them that have memories of coming on the Nyassa, the same ship, and possibly there were two other ships, I think, that used to, Portuguese ships, I don't remember their names, that used to bring, loaded with Jewish refugees from Lisbon. I think the way my uncle got here is, believe it or not, I don't know what ship he came on. I could be, one could discover it, I suppose, is that when the Germans took over Austria, it was called the Anschluss in German. My uncle, who was an Austrian citizen and not a Czech citizen, fled. And the reason he was an Austrian citizen is that when Czechoslovakia became Czechoslovakia, he was a lawyer, and a lot of the professionals were in Vienna because that had been the capital before 1919. So he remained in Vienna as a lawyer, but he fled, interestingly enough, back to Czechoslovakia, which had not been invaded by the Germans yet, and then had to prove to the Czechs that the family had a history there, which it did in Moravia, but then managed to get here in 1939. And the way he got here, he then fled to Nice, and my mother, who maybe I would say had an ample figure, is that how you put it, smuggled all sorts of jewelry and papers to Nice to give him.
Oh, wow.
In other words, his wealth.
Yeah.
And he was a very smart man. I didn't realize really how important he was in our survival. He managed to come to America as a capitalist. Would you believe it? Which you can still do. And as a person who had a permanent residency, he could stay here. He could try to get his family over. And he then employed, I think it was a Jewish brokerage firm called Joseph Scull, which probably doesn't exist anymore, to vouch for us that we would not become a burden and go on welfare. That was the whole story. So we got here not because of some generous whatever it was. I mean, you know the story of the St. Louis, which was returned and all of that.
What do you first remember about the ship?
I happened to be on the ship with my mother and sister. I enjoyed the voyage very much. I'm sure that the adults were under a great deal of stress, which they were all the time, of course, throughout the whole journey, or even, earlier than that. But the ship was full of passengers who were refugees, like we were, Jewish refugees. We were some of the few refugees, it's my understanding, who did not have to eat kosher foods. We were not very religious, or what you would call, I guess, very religious Jews. And so we ate. I think we might have been it could be that we ate with the captain. I vaguely remember they told us that. And one of the memories I actually have of the ship, of where we stayed, is a bunch of hammocks and mattresses on the floor. So I would assume that my mother and my sister stayed with the women who were not who did not have males in the family. And small children. My memories of the ship were very happy because apparently I was one of the few children who spoke some Portuguese. So the crew enjoyed the crew. I had a good time. The crew took me around, and apparently I got into all the machinery. When I arrived, I spoke Czech. I spoke German, which was actually sort of I can't say it was my second language. And I actually didn't learn to speak German until we were in France. As I told Ted, on the ship, because of my little bit of Portuguese, probably because we eat with the captain or whatever. I was lucky, and I had a wonderful time. I mean, to the eyes of a child. Now, maybe my parents, of course, maybe they didn't, and when you talk about travel, I remember the plane we took out of Czechoslovakia a day before the country was actually taken over by the Germans.
Wow.
And I remember that trip, and my parents, it must have been their first flight, for all I know. And I remember somebody took me up to see the pilots. I guess children were sort of, I don't know, they were, I guess, people like children and liked, So I remember walking up to see the pilots and so on. So travel, I guess, for a child was probably a relief from the pressure that you felt from the parents. And believe me, by that point, I already felt a lot of stress from my family. I mean, the people surrounding me. I mean, I can't say I was not affected, but somehow traveling for a child, relieved the pressure somewhat. I think there was a drill we had to put on life jackets because I think a German submarine intercepted us or something. And
oh wow!
And but it didn't torpedo us, and realized that we were a neutral country, Portugal, and so on. And nothing happened. I vaguely record that. I remember that. And of course, I vaguely remember when we arrived in the harbor. It must have been in New York. It must have been night, and somehow the bright lights, seemed to reinforce that silly concept I had of America as being built on stilts in the middle of the ocean like an oil rig. I mean, it took me a while to realize it really was a country, with land mass. Finally, we made contact with a cousin of my mother's who had been here before, who was an interesting character, and he kind of figured out where to go and etc. So since that time, my mother and sister lived in New York, and I, from then on, lived all over the lot. She used to try to send care packages, that's what they were called, to her sister. Now, she didn't know that her sister was in Terezin in Czech, or Theresienstadt in German. And so she would send care packages. So at one point I said to her, well, Mom, maybe I was old enough to realize what she was doing. I don't know. I couldn't have been older than 10. I said, do you really think these are getting to her? And she said, well, what do I know? Well, it turns out that actually, of course, they didn't get there, but that it may have something to do with my sister's survival, because the Germans then knew that she had relatives in America. The Germans were not beyond trying to get, what do you call it, when you free a fugitive, when you pay ransom. They were going to let go of some Jews, if some truckloads of some sort of ransom came. And so they may have preserved her life. Well, there were a couple of reasons. One reason is they they made some of the doctors, they gave some of the doctors the right to be doctors at this place. But of course, there was no medicine. And my aunt, they made a nurse. She had no idea about nursing, but she had been married to a doctor in her first marriage. So these other doctors knew her. She certainly gave me a little bit of trauma when she came to America, and she was never not in tears because the decisions they had to make, the one pill for 1,000 people, who should they give it to, that type of thing.
Oh.
And so she actually caused me some trauma when I was a child, when she came to America when I was 11. Just living with us. She was such a broken human being. But the Germans actually did try to extort Jews money, from people, from other people, I think from some Palestinian group or whatever, towards the end of the war. So that may have played a role in her, in what I thought was sort of silly things.
How did she get out? They let her out, but how did you get her to America? Was that something your mother did, or
yes,
what was that process like?
As soon as the war ended, my mother got on a plane and went to Czechoslovakia and got her sister out and brought her back. Well, whatever she did. I don't know if she came back immediately with her, but got her all the papers, etc. And then she came. She married a man who had survived a German work camp and had it wasn't a concentration camp in the sense that they put you to work, and it was a sort of side camp to the concentration camps if they didn't kill you or whatever. He had lost 3 children from a prior marriage that I tried to find. We never could find him. And she then eventually lived with her husband, which would have been her third husband, because her second husband, who was in the ghetto with her, was deported to Auschwitz and gassed. But it would have been her third husband, and she and that husband moved and opened a jewelry business up in up in some town upstate near Pennsylvania, that little town where Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York meet. The Port Jervis.
Port Jervis,
yeah. And eventually they had a jewelry store in Queens, and where they sold all sorts of jewelry, Catholic, you name it. It wasn't particularly religious, but because he spoke Hungarian and she spoke Czech, and I guess they both spoke German. My aunt's German was a little, it was very good. She went to German school. They would have people just hanging around in that jewelry stores, I remember, in Astoria, Queens, just because there were lonely old people who wanted to speak Hungarian.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
That's sweet. What a nice story, though. It's amazing that she made it out.
Yeah. We went back there with a friend of ours from France, and when I was back in Czechoslovakia, he and I took a trip to a ghetto called Theresian, which in German means in Theresienstadt in German, and it was a fort that Maria Theresa built, in which the Germans imprisoned people, but didn't gas them yet. What would happen is you would get deported to Auschwitz or further east to another ghetto from that place. And what they tried to do is pretend to the Red Cross that they were actually not murdering Jews. So they would occasionally force them to get dressed and play soccer and whatever. It's a famous place. And there's art there and so on. And one of the reasons I wanted to visit that was because my mother's sister survived that.
Oh,
And
wow.
But I had other relatives who didn't. And I had a slew of other relatives, some of whom survived it and some of whom did not. So that's sort of it's a complicated story as to how we got here. And I really never sorted it out till I was in my 70s.
Yeah.
I mean, really, it took a lot of effort.
100,000 refugees have fled from the war, weary and worn, tired and torn, houses burning, no returning, hearts overflow, they're grieving